And welcome to the second of the video lessons on the Dictator's course. This is again another background session with a focus not so much on stuff that will be directly tested, but in order to make you understand the broader context of why the Communist Party is in its weird shape by the time it comes to its leadership struggle. So we are not looking at everything that goes on in the 1920s under Lenin. We are very much focusing on stuff that will become issues or affect the result of the leadership struggle or the future. So the first thing we're looking to look at is the economic policy. Now this will be a massive factor in leadership struggle. Which side various people take will define their success. And in addition, it will be addressed and further dealt with by Stalin in the economic essay. So during the Civil War, there is a massive, as mentioned in the previous lesson, the war itself is not won by decent soldiers, decent armies. It is a brawl between several sides, all of which are led by people who don't know what they're doing, with soldiers who don't really want to be there, with very, very poor equipment. And therefore, as mentioned in the previous lesson, the winner will be those who best marshals the resources that they have with them and best uses them effectively in the field. So what the communists are faced with, like everyone else, is massive shortages in food. The rural areas which produce food, particularly Siberia and the region in the south and in Ukraine, are under control of the Wipes or are very rebellious. So whenever the Reds try and go and get food, they end up getting killed by the local peasantry. This makes massive problems in the army as they don't get fed. And why would you die for a force, for an army or a people who can't even feed you? And a lack of food in the cities. And this means that we have desertions, soldiers leaving, we have soldiers not following orders, we find people not working very hard. And this is primarily due to the peasants themselves essentially realizing that there's a war going on. They need to look after and make sure they be able to feed themselves, with lots of keeping extra reserves of food because they never know when an army will come through and burn all their crops, but also because they see profit. Where there are food shortages, the law of supply and demand dictates that price rises will increase, and therefore peasants will make more money. And so what we find is that part of the reason for the food shortages is that peasants are withholding grain for personal or financial benefit. In addition, the industry itself, the limited factories that exist, because they're so badly run and because they're so poorly organized and poorly structured, what we end up having is a system where the factories that they do have aren't producing enough stuff of good enough quality. It is not helped by the fact that factories themselves are run by Soviets, which are committees of workers. Now, although the communists like to think that when the people are in charge of their own factories, they will work harder, this tends to be the opposite. They tend to give themselves a little bit more of a break. They tend to pay themselves more for doing less work, and it tends not to be the same sort of pushes for improvement and innovation. And that means industry itself tends to be fairly poor. So what the communists respond to and how they respond to this problem is they increasingly develop state control, and they develop the size of the state and its use of force. What they do essentially is they send soldiers into the countryside and requisition grain. That means steal grain from the peasants, look around their houses, look around their hiding holes, and basically take the grain they need to deal with the shortages of food. They take over industry, they nationalise industry, ban private trade, and also put much more control over what the workers can and cannot do. Now this is very uncommunist, but it's necessary to win the war. And if you remember from the last video lesson, the key message of the Civil War is it essentially takes the existing ideology and warps it into a more extreme and bureaucratic form. War communism is a great example of this. You've got the idea of what everyone's equal doesn't work to win the war, and therefore what they end up going is super big state, super brutal. We will take your stuff, tell you what to do, and take over industry. Now, this is not very ideologically pure. This is essential, though, to win the war, because it means that the food, although the peasants have a sad time and they end up being very, 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 very negative, and they end up resisting and there's lots of violence, it does, at least in the short term, help supply the army and win the war. It doesn't solve problems. The economy is still deeply flawed, but it is now marginally better, and more importantly, better than the whites, who are not doing this and therefore have the same food problems and the industrial problems and no way to solve it. In theory, the left wing like this war communism because this is closer to the dictatorship of the proletariat. We mentioned that last time, but if you remember, the socialist stage of communism says there is a complete control from the state in order to remold society and undo the damage of capitalism and feudalism. And so therefore the left of the Communist Party, with people talking about Trotsky and to some extent Kamenev and Zinoviev, they like this because this is the first step into the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is, however, massively unpopular amongst the poor, the average person, and even the most lowest level communists who have to interact with the peasants on a daily basis, because they see the violence this creates, they see the problems this creates in factories, as there's labour discipline, so people being fined for not turning up for work or being put in prison for not working hard enough. And this creates lots of problems. So war communism, although it's popular amongst the ideological left, amongst the average Russian, it's very deeply unpopular because essentially they're having their stuff taken and being made to work harder for less money, and they're being brutally punished if they don't do it. And so what ends up happening is, although this helps win the war, and by 1921-22 it's really paid off, what we have in 1921 is a massive, and very poor spelling there, a massive rebellion amongst the masses, particularly with the symbolic Kronstadt mutiny. Essentially, peasants don't like to give food, labour doesn't like to be made to work, and the communists increasingly rely on the Cheka, C-H-E-K-A, second bullet point down, to force people to give food and force them to work. Now, then people become more violent against the Cheka, and therefore the Cheka becomes more violent back. And therefore we see a gradually escalating extremism in Russia, with strike happening amongst workers opposition groups from within the Communist Party itself trying to give independence to workers and make unions be able to fight for the workers as opposed to what they were doing, which was working for the state. And so what we see is a real resistance in the Communist Party itself as well as the wider population. Now what ends up happening is, and in Lenin's words, lighting up reality like a lightning flash, is that the Kronstadt naval base, the naval base just outside St. Petersburg, which was one of the most revolutionary and had traditionally been very, very communist and anarchist and had supported the communists in the October Revolution, they rebelled against the communists, who they said were ruining the socialist cause and just replacing one tyranny and dictatorship with another. And in March 1921, we have the Kronstadt mutiny. And they basically argue for that the socialism will continue, but without the communists. Now, if you remember from the last video lesson we talked about, the communists, although many Russians were supported socialism, the Communist Party itself was not massively popular. It was only really popular in the cities, and even then in Petrograd, as it was renamed, St. Petersburg previous to that, and Moscow. Outside of there, it really wasn't very popular. And so what we see is a massive rebellion which was deeply problematic. Now, this is crushed. It's crushed by Trotsky, which makes him even more unpopular. And Lenin deliberately orders Trotsky to do it rather than do it himself, because obviously he doesn't want unpopularity. But Lenin also realizes that things need to change. The economic policy of war communism, doesn't really be needed anymore because they're kind of winning the war. But also, as Bukharin says, we need to make economic concessions, i.e. give something economically, make people happy economically, to avoid having to change the political system, i.e. the communist control. And so what they end up moving on to is something called the NEP, or a new economic policy. And the idea is what we'll have is a little bit of capitalism. Local level, small businesses and farmers and peasants are allowed to make a profit, a little bit of a profit, to encourage people to make more food. Because the problem what peasants were doing is, because they knew the food was going to be taken anyway, they just didn't bother to grow it. And you can't requisition something that doesn't grow. So the idea was that instead of having a tax, the peasants will be expected to give a certain amount of food to the communist government. Everything beyond that, they could then sell. And that will encourage you to make more food and be more effective and be more efficient in order to make some money. It also allowed small businesses and small factories to operate, although the larger industries and the heavy industries and those like armaments, or those like steel, were kept in control of the Communist Party because they're still very important. And the NEP essentially brings in not capitalism entirely, but a element of the market at the lower levels in food supply where there's the greatest problems. Now this creates a massive debate in the 10th Party Congress and huge problems, and it's only because obviously this is seen as betraying communism, and it's only passed with Lenin's support, where he basically argues that this is not communism, this is not ideal, but this is a temporary setback, a temporary concession, a temporary thing to give in order to avoid more mutinies and violence. Now, the NEP is actually relatively successful. We see output increase 200%. We see peace back in the cities and countryside. We see consumer goods, stuff people want, chairs, clothes. We're not talking about fancy things, basic stuff, but stuff that makes people happy and less rebellious, increase massively. We also see more food produced and a greater range of food produced, not just grain. We see meat come back on the menu. We see various other fruits and vegetables come on the menu with lower prices. So this is from an economic perspective, and argue from a political perspective in terms of immediate stability, this really helps. And therefore, lots of the supporters on the right of the Communist Party who said NEP was important and were pretty much listening to the average peasant and the average person party member, look at this and say the NEP has proved to be true. However, it has some negatives. If you have a market, you're naturally going to have winners and losers. And in the cities, there became the rise of what we call NEP men, people who own small businesses or were the middlemen between the peasants and the cities trading food, who made profit. And there was a concern that, although there weren't that many of them, that there were some people who were becoming richer than others. And it was almost like communism had become watered down, had become limited by this process. In the countryside, a similar thing was happening. There were some farmers who, because they worked harder, or because they were luckier, or because they were more productive, or because they were just better at their job and worked harder, they tended to be able to have more surplus, more left over after the stuff they had to give the Communist Party was given in, and therefore made more money. And because they made more money, they bought more land, they bought more tools, and they made more money. And so what we see is a rise of inequality, which for a communist society is less than ideal. In addition, with more money floating around, and particularly more money floating around in a situation where there's also a big state, we see corruption. We see kulaks and netmen bribing party members to let them have an advantage, or at least not have to give as much tax. And that tends to rot away at the Communist Party, because as soon as corruption becomes normal, it's hard to get rid of. And so there seems to be corruption, particularly at the lower levels of the Communist Party. People in charge of the regions, particularly outside of the major cities where the Communist Party can keep an eye on what's going on. And this causes massive problems. In addition, with the inequality comes conspicuous consumption. The rich need to flaunt their wealth. They go to operas, they wear fur coats, they drive cars. And therefore this leads to a massive rise in hostility, particularly from the left. They see the NEP as only bringing back life under the Tsars. They believe if it continues, we'll have essentially a social democracy, which is, they say they're socialist, but actually capitalism is allowed to rule, and all the cause of socialism doesn't happen. And they are probably right, although they don't necessarily appreciate the need for the political and economic relief and recovery that is engendered by the NEP. So the NEP will be a massive cause of contention in the leadership process, partly because it doesn't have an obvious answer. The line is between, do you want economic growth and political stability, or do you want ideological purity? And both sides has supporters. And Stalin will navigate between the two, with whatever is politically convenient. So the NEP, although you won't get tested on it, is a very helpful thing to understand why are people taking the positions they do. Now, a second outcome of this civil war is the factionalism dispute. Factionalism will be the cornerstone of understanding why the leadership struggle is how it is. If you remember, Hitler comes to power because he's elected. Franco comes to power because of a coup. How one comes to power in communism is very different. It is about your ability to get majority of votes in the party congress and central committee. Now, that's not a natural thing. All of these people have parties, but their parties don't matter so much. The difference is the factionalism rule. So the background to factionalism, in 1920s, in the extremism of war and the demands of war, and then war communism upsetting people, we see the workers' opposition emerge, and the democratic centralists and centralisms emerge. Workers' opposition basically argue that the Communist Party is not being nice to workers of war communism, and therefore needs to go back to its communist roots. And democratic centralists argue that there should be no democracy and no debate and no ideas outside the party. And once the party has come up with a position, there should be no disagreement, because the fear was if you have disagreement amongst the party, that would only inspire the enemies to take advantage of that. It's better to have a united front publicly, and therefore people won't get the ideas to rebel. So what we have is a crisis of war, famine, counter-revolution, with the party increasingly diverging. In a 10th Party Congress, after significant debate and argument, Lenin, in order to deal with this, secures what is known as a ban on factions, and this becomes known as factionalism. Now, a faction is a group who disagrees with whatever the party line is. Now, this seems obvious until you realise that we also have democratic centralism. So you are allowed to debate because of democratic centralism, i.e. you can have a debate within the party, because otherwise you'll have a tyranny on whoever was one person choosing, and that's not very communist. But at the same time, you can't disagree with the party line. So there's a tension here. You are allowed to debate, but you are not allowed to disagree with the party line. So how do you resolve this? Well, what they say is, the party line, once it has been agreed by the Central Committee, which often leans on the Party Congress to vote on most things, it becomes the party line. It becomes the official position of the Communist Party. So you can say NEP is bad, NEP is bad, but the moment the Central Committee says NEP is good, that is the party line. And if you then continue to say NEP is bad, you are now a faction. You are now going against the party line. Now, what does this mean? If you do this, you will be expelled from the party. And if you remember from the previous lesson, as a result of the Civil War, the party, and if you have a job in the party, you have a job in the state. If you lose your job in the party, you lose your job in the state. So you basically lose all power and you become a nobody. So what it means is, if you can control the Party Congress, if you can control the Central Committee, if you can make sure what you want happens, your opponents either have to agree with you, or ideally they still disagree with you. They say one thing against you and you remove them from the party and you kick them out. Therefore, this means that the way that you become leader is not by being popular amongst the people, because there ain't no election. It's not by being popular amongst the army, because there's not many coups. It's your ability to win votes in the communist internal bureaucracy in its party. Particularly win arguments and debates, and more importantly, not necessarily win debates, but win the votes through bribery, blackmail, stealing, alliances, and so on. And therefore, this becomes a perfect weapon to stifle debates and destroy enemies. If you control the majority, and no one person will control the majority until about 1928, and that's obviously Stalin. But before that, if you make alliances with other people, you will have the majority in the Party Congress and or the Central Committee, and therefore you'll be able to say this is the official line, and if the people against you argue against that, continue it, you remove them. Each individual who loses the power leadership struggle will be removed this way until there is only Stalin left. This factionalism is vital, and it only happens because of the sheer fact that you cannot have a leadership internal dispute during a civil war. That's why Lenin justifies it. That's why he's able to get it through against many people who are very suspicious of this. And that's partly why Lenin does it, because he is just so sick of internal opposition when everything is at stake in a war. This will be vital. So the last thing is the Civil War also shapes how the Communist Party runs the rest of Russia. So all the stuff unrelated to the war still is affected by the war and changes how Lenin rules. He becomes more direct, more brutal, more willing to use terror, more likely to take extreme positions, and therefore will shape his leadership. So it will make him in many ways seen as a hero, particularly to the Socialists. But the fact he won it against the odds, won the war, makes him seen as a effective military theorist, although actually it was Trotsky who ran it. The fact that he increasingly went away from his "we should work together" to "I will be in charge in order to win the war because everyone around me is morons" reinforces his image as a central theorist. In addition, we should argue there were some genuine socialist innovations in this period. You'll never get tested on this, but Stalin will go massively against these, and you will get tested on that. So it's important to know the before picture before you look at the after. So Lenin, for example, pushes female equality, although perhaps not as much as he wanted. Well, he said he did. But women, legally at least, if not in practice, were given much more equality. They were allowed to divorce, they were allowed to marry as they want, they were allowed to work equally. Now, attitudes didn't change, so this was limited, but the law changed. There's much more experimentation in the arts, much more fluidity, much more modernism, much more innovation, and much more equality in terms of economic and social and racial factors. Not as much as perhaps it was the ideal, and certainly not as much as communists should, but much more than Tsarist Russia, particularly in a short period of time. He was also very, very pragmatic when he needed to, with elite middle class and upper class army officers being middle class specialists like engineers and doctors being allowed to continue and actually being paid a bit more in order to achieve the short-term goal of winning the civil war and creating stability. We can also say the NEP helped, and it showed his pragmatism in order to try and get something done, and it made some changes. And we can also argue that on average, compared to the Tsar, which admittedly is a very low bar, the amount of people who own their own land and their quality of life as a result did increase. So you could argue, as someone who genuinely pushes a change, he is a socialist hero. However, this came at a cost. As a result of the Civil War, yes, he pushes his stuff, but he only pushes his stuff because he increasingly gets control. He dominates the party despite the fact that, in theory, the Communist Party is egalitarian, i.e., believes in the complete equality, and arguably this helped Stalin eventually because it normalizes the idea of one man in control. As you mentioned before in lesson, Lenin wanted, after his death, it to be ruled by committee. Now we can say that's what he wanted, and that's why he did his testament, but in reality, by leading so brazenly as one man in control, it ends up only normalizing it, making it normal, and therefore not that scary when someone ends up trying to seize power all on their own, i.e. Stalin. He uses terror and says terror is totally legitimate, the checker, and then what becomes known as the OGPU or the GPU, against political and social enemies, particularly against churches and minorities, and therefore makes it normal to use force. And that's something Stalin will use again. He is responsible for war communism. It was his idea, and something that he is very much supportive of and only moves away from reluctantly, and he destroys all the other socialist parties, including the more popular Social Revolutionary and the Mensheviks. And it's his fault the state became so large, centralized, bureaucratic and undemocratic. He made that in response to the Civil War, and he supported that. His reaction to the Civil War was to limit debate, reduce the amount of people who have power outside the Communist Party, and try and control every eventuality. Now, when he dies, that state will continue, and it will give power and an advantage to someone like Stalin, who is at this hidden but important position within that state. So his reaction to the Great Depression, his reaction to the Civil War, which was to create this massive terror state, will only be used later by Stalin. And arguably, he is also a poor judge of character and policy. He allows ruthless and ambitious men to come to power and to stay in power, Stalin, but also people like Zinoviev and, to a lesser extent, people like Trotsky, and he allows them to exist without any thought about what happens when he dies. And many of his reforms end up, yes, being ideally legally positive, but actually stuff like the legalization of divorce ends up just meaning women get pregnant and get abandoned by men happily, and therefore creates actually more problems for women in Russia than one wanted. So we can say Lenin is in part responsible for Stalin's rise to power not by wanting him to come to power, but by creating a set of circumstances that normalize one person's in charge, the role of terror, the role of the destruction of any democracy, and the importance of the state and the bureaucracy and the party, which Stalin will take advantage of, and putting Stalin and various others in position to have a fight amongst themselves, that he makes the situation, the circumstances which help Stalin come to power. And it once was a past essay question, which was how far is Lenin responsible? And the answer is he's not directly responsible. He didn't want Stalin to come to power, but by creating these circumstances that Stalin will then exploit, he then comes to power. So if we are to summarize him, he is sold often as either socialist hero who is the true communist, who Stalin undermines, or by his opponents as just as bad as Stalin, but because he didn't kill as many people, because he wasn't in power as long, people don't think as much negative of him. And they say any communist will be as brutal as Stalin, and they point at Lenin and his negative stuff he does as evidence of that. The truth is probably likely between these two extremes. He was more pragmatic and generally more ideological than Stalin. Stalin tends to care more about just staying in power and achieving very narrow ends. Whereas Lenin tends to be a little bit more concerned with the broader picture. Although his intentions are brutal and horrible if you are a middle-class person, or even if you're a peasant, you could argue he had at least more quote-unquote good intentions than, say, Stalin. Stalin is nakedly trying to secure power more than Lenin. Lenin will do stuff he does not believe in personally, but ideologically he believes in, like the stuff about art and gender. He was actually quite conservative in his tastes, but he went along with it because he believed in the broader idea. And we can say that's probably better intentions than, say, Stalin, which is just violence. Yet still, he is a violent revolutionary who is more than happy to use violence and force to coerce people to do negative things in order to secure power and transform society. So although his violence isn't just sadism, he's not doing it for fun, he does see violence, death and destruction as necessary. Got to break a few eggs to make an omelette for the transmission of society. And therefore what we see is a man who is ideological, and arguably a little bit more ideological and fair than the Russian Communist Party. However, ends up being also simultaneously violent and death-defying, because that's how communists roll. So if we're going to summarize, the Civil War and how the communists, particularly Lenin, responds to it will shape a lot of what's going to happen in the future. And it's important to think about in case they ask one of the weird questions about the past. The lesson of all things prior to 1924 is it creates the circumstances, and your job would be to show how the Civil War, how Lenin, how the party before the war and before the struggle creates the circumstances. That will make more sense when we see about how Stalin takes to power. But it will be through force, through his position in the party, and through the idea that he'll be one man in control more than anything else. Thank you for listening to this. We have one final background lesson on the party itself, and then we'll move on to the essay question itself.